Olá a todos, sejam bem-vindos aqui a mais uma Conversas no Tabuleiro. E hoje temos um convidado muito especial, temos o Franz Joseph Herbst, da editora Franjos, alemã, que está no fundo a apoiar-nos na realização do primeiro campeonato nacional de Can't Stop. Ele está aqui hoje para nos dar uma entrevista exclusiva. Vamos falar no fundo da editora e do trabalho realizado ao longo dos últimos anos. Franz, welcome here to our conversations. Are you okay?
I'm okay.
Okay.
Good morning, Luis.
Really, thanks for this interview, friends. So we are going to start in this first part to talk about the beginning of Frangos. So it was in 1987 that Frangos appeared in the German board game market. How it was that beginning of the company?
Yes, the beginning was in 1986 when I had a meeting with my cousin. At that time, we were both students, and he was about to finish his studies and wanted to become a teacher, but he had no chance to get a job. And so he had to find an alternative, and this was building a games company, a publishing company. And yes, this was what we were talking about in 1986. I was not familiar with this, but it was interesting. So he gave me a prototype of a game he has designed, and I tested it, and I liked it. And so we discussed the possibility of building a games publishing company. But sometimes later he got a job as a teacher, and so the idea of games publishing was off the table for him. But I was still interested. I found the idea exciting, and so I started the company in 1987. I got a loan and started the company.
Okay. And it was there is something also interesting with the name of the company, because it's the connection with two names: your name, and the name of the first game, Aladdin's Legacy. But it's also, I'd like to ask you about the logo of Frangos. How it appeared?
Yeah, it was the idea of my cousin, and it was his design. So Frangos was the name, and the idea to add a player made with Tetris parts was his idea. Okay. And so it's his design, and it's still a good logo, I think. And so we kept it all the time. The font changed a bit during the time, but it's still the same since years.
Okay. You continue, and now it's a reference for the company, of course.
Yes.
Yeah, of course. And so the first game released in '87 was Aladdin's Legacy, and so why you have choose to start with this game in particular?
It was the game my cousin has designed, and I was not familiar with the games market at that time. We played a lot as children, but during my studies, I had no connection to board gaming, and the interest came when my cousin, showed me his game, and there was no alternative, and I didn't know about alternatives at that time.
Okay, but there is something interesting in that first edition of Aladdin's Legacy is about the materials that it was used, and it was I think a synthetic litter, and how it was the reception of this kind of games in the 80s in Germany.
Yes, there has been a model for that kind of boards. It was the Edition Perlhuhn. This company had published already some games with this material, and so we took this idea. The big advantage was that it was possible to start a production with a low quantity. So it was possible to produce 500 copies of Aladdin's Legacy. And if we had produced the game with a box, And with the normal paperboard, it would have needed much higher quantities, which would have not been possible at the time.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, the audience liked the game and they liked the material, but the retailers didn't.
Okay.
The map could not be folded, so the box had to be very large. And box is the wrong name. We started with a tube, so I can show you how this looked at that time.
Okay, okay.
So yes. This was not what retailers wanted to have.
Yes, of course. It's really, but it's really interesting to see the evolution also from the games published. Let's talk about the games of Friendzos. We have here some of the games that you have published. What, in your opinion, your website is really complete. There is a lot of information concerning all the games and also all the authors. So it's very congratulations with your website with the information. But just to understand, in your opinion, what is the trademark of Friendzos about games? What kind of games publish Friendzos?
Yes, our audience is the casual gamer. So I think the market is divided in 3 parts. Today we have games for children, we have games for the casual gamer, and we have games for the hobby gamer. And the Franjos Ojos is the casual gamer. And so we need simple rules. We need a short playing time. All things that hobby gamers don't need. They have no problems with playing games for 2 or 3 hours. And with complex rules, that's not a problem for hobby gamers, but it is for casual gamers.
Okay. Concerning my next question, I think it's more or less you have give the response. So, for example, for choose or not choose to publish a new game for Friendzos, these aspects are essential. So the time of play also and the simplicity of the rules are key aspects to choose or not choose a game to publish. No.
A game must have something special. There must be something new. It mustn't be complex or complicated, but it should be new. An example from the last year, I think, is Root, where my opinion is that players have different rules for their figures. And so it would be new enough for Franjos, but too complex for Franjos.
Okay.
So it's not easy to find such games. But it's worth it.
Okay. And during all the dozens of years of Friendzos life and the games published, so you have a lot of games published. I just would like to ask you if during all the games published, is there any kind of game that, for example, at the beginning it was like you were not absolutely convinced that the game could be a good game for the market, but it was a winning? Or for example, is there any kind of example like this?
Difficult question. Maybe it's Glastonbury, which was a 2-players game when it was first published some years ago, and it was called Kopperkettel, I think, and Co. And it was for 2 players only. And the new edition published by Franjos was for up to 4 players. So we had to add some stuff, had to add some rules, and we included some more activity cards. So it was not, we could not be sure that the audience would like what happened with this game. Although there were a lot of people who liked the original game, but this was a risk. But I think it was a good decision to do so. This is why we published a 2nd edition last year with a new rules variant, but still with the original rules too and the same stuff. So this is a good point if I can do a second print run, that the game has been quite successful.
Okay, and just I remember a question concerned to this is about. So you speak about the three kind of markets that there is in board game, but usually the Friendjo's games are more the principal market is Germany or is other countries?
It's half and half. So if I could not work together with other publishers or with partners in selling the games in foreign countries, it would not be possible to run Franjos anymore. So it's the combination of the German market and the market outside Germany.
Okay.
That makes it possible.
That makes it possible, the business. So about also the games, there is something really interesting in the Friendjo's games. There are some authors, some reference authors in your games. We have Alex Randolph, we have Sid Sexton, Eric Solomons, like great references. I would just like to ask you that continue in the catalog in the moment. So I'd like to ask you, it's what is the importance of these authors for these recognized authors for the catalog of Friendjo's?
Yeah, it has to do with the beginning of Franjos. In 1987, there have not been published many games, and the games known have been by some designers you already mentioned. And not to forget Rudi Hoffmann, which has been published many games in Germany. And he was the first external designer of games. We published at Franjos. It was Schuss and Tor in Germany and Trüffeln, Schnüffeln. And so the first three games from Franjos, two of these games have been by Rudi Hoffmann. And of course, it was quite interesting to get the licenses from the other designers like Sid Sexton, Alex Randolph, and Eric Solomon. But they were very open, and my experience in the years following was that working with these well-known designers have often been much easier than working together with new designers.
Okay.
They had the experience, and they knew in most cases what was to do or not to do. And this is experience new designers at that time didn't have.
Okay, really interesting. And now my next question is concerning this. So it's now we have the market in the world with I think thousands of games are every year appear. So do you think is there still a space for a career like a game designer, even with this the world have changed a lot? What do you think about this market?
Yes, I think there is a chance, and there are some designers like Steffen Bendorf or Alexander Pfister or Wolfgang Warsch, which have published some games in the last years. And 10 years ago, no one knew them, and they haven't published games at that time. So it's possible, but of course, it's not easy.
Of course. So now we are going to make some questions concerning the game that we are going to use also in the first national championship. Is about Can't Stop. So it's a game that appeared in the first years of Friends. I think in 1991 it was the first edition. How it was possible to have the Can't Stop in your catalog?
Yes. Yeah, I tried to contact Sid Sexton in 1990, which was not easy, for internet was not existing. So I got the address from Alex Randolph. And I wrote a letter to Sid Sexton. It was a snail mail at that time. And I asked for 3 games. One was Network, one was Can't Stop, and one was Domino Beat Game. And a month later, I got an answer from him, and he told me that he was interested in licensing the games, but not for Can't Stop. For another publisher was examining the game and testing it, And so it was not possible to get a license for Can't Stop in 1990. And so, yeah, we wrote letters, I to him, he to me. And in one letter, 1 month later, he told me that the company examining Can't Stop did not want to publish Can't Stop. And so this was available for me. But Domino Beat Game was not available for another company, was interested in this game.
Okay.
But so we made an agreement for Can't Stop, and this was the beginning of the production in 1991.
Okay. And now, after all these years, so I think Frangers is the publisher that have more editions of the Can't Stop. It's really, really interesting. And in your website, we can see it, the evolution of the editions of the game. It's beautiful. And so, in this case, what do you think that the evolution of the editions shows about also Frangers? What have changed also during these years about the publisher?
Yes, Can't Stop is a good example for that. For the game has been part of Frangers for nearly the whole time. And I can show you the first edition, so you can see that the artwork has changed, of course. So this is the first one, first edition. And compared to the actual one, you can see a huge difference. The box is smaller, but this is the reason that the playing maps could not be folded, so they had to be rolled, and the dimension of this was the need for the package.
Yeah, it's true. And another thing is about the game. So the game Can't Stop is a game, a Frangers game, but is also now, during the last I think years, one of the games most played in Board Game Arena, because it's also a very easy game in a digital way. And I'd like to ask you, as a publisher, how do you look at this reality now about board games in the internet?
From time to time, I play online too, but I prefer to play at the table with friends. But they are not always there, so it's a good alternative. I hope that it increases the sales too if players play a game which they didn't know at the beginning and like it. So maybe he or she buys it afterwards to play it at the table. But I don't have numbers about that. It's just a hope.
Okay. It's true. And so this year, the 2020, we have this pandemic, this situation about COVID-19. And I'd like to ask you about Frangers' activity, and also maybe the board game market in Germany. What kind of impact this situation has?
Yeah, it's very difficult, of course. I saw that the market in Germany for board games increased by 20%, but I cannot follow this. I don't have this expansion. I guess that most of the games are bought online at the moment, and that people buy the games they already know. So it's very difficult at the moment to let people learn new games. And I tried to Kickstarter for a new edition of Formel Fun this year, which I stopped for one reason was that the shipping costs increased, and it was not possible to ship games to several countries during this year. And so I wanted to avoid problems and stop this. On the other side, my retailers told me to delay the publishing to next year, for they have a similar problem to show new games to their audience. For there are no events in the shops, and they have to keep distance, which makes it very difficult. And of course, there are no fairs where new games could be presented, and so it's difficult. Yes.
And there are something that well, for us that are interested in this subject, it's strange, a little awkward for us, because in Portugal we don't have really a board game market. Not really. We have some games, but not really a board game market. I would just like to ask you how it was possible that in Germany there is this kind of dynamic, and how it is possible just to work in this subject, not being a second job, but being the job.
It's my second job.
Okay.
My first job is I'm a houseman, so my wife is working.
Okay.
If she would not work, it would not be possible to exist from Franius alone. So in this combination, it's possible. Nevertheless, there are other companies that live from doing a job as a publisher. But I think the companies that have been established in the past years address the gamers market. And this is the market that has most increased in the past years. So, for example, Feuerland games or Lookout games in Germany, I think they really can live from their job. And there are other publishers in other countries too. But for publishers who address the casual gamers market, it's difficult. I'm not sure which company has been successful with publishing casual games. Maybe the company who published Skio. This is quite successful, not only in Germany but worldwide. And I think he did a good job to have a success with just one game, and this addresses the casual gamers market.
Okay. And about also the reality of the German market. So there are also big companies. About in the just German market, it's possible for like a company like Franius compete with these large companies. There is space for everyone.
Yes, there is space, but it's more to survive in this market, not to grow.
Okay.
It's as you said, the competitors for Franius games are more the big companies like Ravensburger or Cosmos, and we don't compete with, for example, Feuerland games or Lookout games. There have been big players in the market which grew in the last years. For example, Pegasus in Germany especially, or of course Asmodee worldwide, which took a huge part of the market. But they do a lot for it too, so it's okay. Maybe they grow the market, so there is more space for smaller companies like Franius in the future. So it's we have to see.
Okay. How it happens. And so another thing very curious, and in Franius we can see it also, is so the publishing houses have a little concern about the update of the artwork of the games. We can see that not only in Catstop but in other games. And I just would like to ask you, what is the importance for nowadays of this update of the artwork in the games?
Yes, sometimes they are influenced from outside. For example, Can't Stop, the edition in 2011 was well done, I think, but it looked a bit childish. So retailers asked me to make a new edition which is addressing adults more. So this was the reason to invest in artwork. And yes, the same thing is this year, where we again changed the board and to make it playable for older people too. For the contrast has been a problem with older people sometimes. And my wife's mother is 92 years old, so she is a good partner. And tells me, oh, I can see that. So I get impact from such situations.
Okay. So this is something that actually happens now. But about also this history of Frangers, there are so many years that you are a part of your life is dedicated to your company, to this to the games, and how you see all these more or less 30 years of history of Frangers, which are for you the years of the moments mark in the moments of these 30 years.
Yes, one was of course my partner Franz Josef Schulte stopped his activities in 2010, which was difficult. But I decided to run Franjos furthermore. This was a step, and of course the first game where we left the plastic board maps. It was in 2007 with the publishing of Black Box Plus.
Okay.
And internet changed a lot of. So we started a web shop some years ago. Kickstarter has become important for Franjos 2. We have funded 4 games, not only Kickstarter but crowdfunding as the main concept. So Mahé, publishing of Mahé in 2014 was very important, for this has been a big success till today. And so Mahé was really important, so it allowed to go on with the company.
Okay. So there's some moments that there is something important for the growth of the company, and so Mahé, it was one of these moments. So about the edition, so Glastonbury that we have here, I think it was the most recent published game, the last one, I think, as I saw in the catalog online. But what is because of this pandemic, you cannot show right now a new one. But what are your ideas for the next year?
Yes, Glastonbury was the last production, but it was not a really new entry in the Franjos range. It was Finca in 2018. Glastonbury, the last production was 2019. So you are right, it was the last production. But Finca was a new game. Glastonbury has been the first print run of Glastonbury was in 2015, I think. So it was a reprint in 2019. But Finca 2018 was a new game for Franjos, but has been an old game, for it has been published by Hans im Glück some years before. Concerning the plans for the next year, it is of course Formel Fun. The artwork has been finished, so I will start a new Kickstarter for it. And 2015, I think, we published Domus Domini and work since years on a revised edition, or with new rules, new variants, but had to stop this because of Corona. There's been one variant which has been published online at the Franjos website, and I think there will be more in the next months. But working on these is still difficult at the moment. For Domus Domini is for up to 6 players. It's not possible to get so many players at the table at the moment.
Yes.
So maybe this will be delayed. But Formel Fun is a game which we published in 1990 first. It's the rules are fixed. Okay, there will be a variant for the new edition. But we know that the game is a good game. We played it often. We played it already at fairs in the past. We sold copies. And so there's no risk for this, I think.
Of course, that is very, very, very important. Okay. So, friends, we really appreciate your this opportunity to explain us a little bit about the German board market and also the history of Franjos. we desire to you, to your company, the best for the next years, and we hope also to stay in touch for other opportunities in the future.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.